Good morning. I'm still out in Titusville this morning. It's a little windy, but what I thought I would do, and this is probably going to be something that we're going to be doing hopefully over the next couple of weeks, which is to go live when things are happening. Although in this case, it's really more the crew's doing a news conference around 11:30 a.m. local, and so I think in the name of people wanting to watch that, I'm going to try and end the stream at least a little bit before that, and then I have to get out to the Space Center for the 2 p.m. news conference. What would that be? 1400 Eastern. So what is that? That's 1800 UTC. So what I won't I'm not going to do a lot of presentation this morning, but I did want to talk about we're also coincidentally at the end of the first quarter of 2026. A lot of things have happened. A lot of questions still remain, but I thought if for those of you who are here a little early, I can try and take a few questions before 9:30 a.m. Eastern, or the bottom of the hour, for those of you who are remember what clocks look like with faces on them. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, so I think right now, just again overview wise, we're at a probably really more L minus 3.5 days, but still the launch is Wednesday, or at least it's still targeted for Wednesday evening local. But Wednesday, all day Wednesday, we're going to be watching the tanking. We're going to be watching the crew get on board, and so there's going to be a lot of activity on Wednesday, and the countdown starts tomorrow at, as it says here, at 4:44 p.m. Eastern, 4:44 p.m. local time, and so that's about what is that? That'd be 2044 UTC tomorrow, and the first opportunity is on Wednesday. The launch window opens, as you see here. That's the when the launch window opens. It's a 2-hour long launch window, and we will see. Sunset is not for, I think, another hour and change after that. So there's again at least a possibility that the vehicle will lift off in some kind of daylight. And so again, I think we'll see how things go. I know that Commander Reed Weissman talked about being ready to fly on Wednesday, but it requires everything to be ready to launch, including the weather. It's very windy here today. I guess a cold front passed through, and so it's not particularly cold, but it is windy, and so that would be a problem if they were trying to launch today, or at least it would be a concern. So, and I believe that United Launch Alliance was planning to launch an Atlas with Amazon Leo satellites. I think is being accommodating about this launch window because of the, and so everybody is for the most part scheduling around, with of course the exception of SpaceX Falcon, because they've already implemented the autonomous flight safety system, autonomous flight termination system. So that does not require as much. That doesn't require as much work by the Eastern Test Range, and so they can continue their flight schedule. So I'm not expecting to get a chance to ask questions of the crew at the press conference. And it's, I think the questions that were they answered questions for a long time on Friday when they arrived at Kennedy Space Center, and so you have to keep an eye on. Have to keep an eye on the. There seem to be adjusting the camera lighting, thankfully. But there are a lot of good questions are asked, and sometimes, sometimes the questions that are asked, you try and think of a good question to ask, and sometimes the simplest questions are you get really interesting answers from the crew. And so there were there were a wide range of questions on Friday. I thought the crew responses were really interesting, really cool in some cases. And so I think I remember a question about somebody asked them about their what inspired them when they were kids, and I thought that those responses were really interesting. So I think for this channel, I would be more interested in this is probably not the forum for it, which is more about flying the mission and going into more details about what how they're going to fly the mission and some of the phases of flight. And so it's not a particularly good forum for going into going down the rabbit holes. And so I'm not expecting to ask questions today, and I think, again, as I was saying, in a roundabout way, I think that they'll get some interesting questions today, and those will be interesting. I think the briefing that I'm looking forward to more is the briefing at 2 p.m. because it has the NASA side, I believe, the NASA side program managers for the main elements. Let me go check that though. I think, and I know that the NASA program managers for SLS and Orion are there. I can't remember if Sean Quinn is the Exploration Ground Systems Program representative, but there will be somebody there. And as there are so many things going on, and I'll get into that here. I'm going to wait until the bottom of the hour at 9:30 to get into some of that stuff. But so yeah, again, if we still have a few minutes here. If anybody has any other questions, so yeah, I think I'll be watching. Like everybody else here at 11th in a couple of hours to see what else the crew has to say. Not sure where they're going to be, if they're going to be at crew quarters in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, or an undisclosed location. But I guess what I can do here and I'll go through it again, but just kind of to look at the countdown a little bit. So again, this is based on an April 1st launch with they would be targeting T0 at the opening of the launch window, which would be, again, Wednesday evening here local at 6:24 p.m. Eastern. So there are NASA released the countdown, a countdown reference, I think was it on Friday? A couple of days ago. So call to stations will be tomorrow afternoon, and then 10 minutes after that, the countdown clock will start. It'll start at T-minus 45 hours and 15 minutes and counting. And there are 3 built-in holds. All of them will be on Wednesday, and they have they're planned for 4 hours and 25 minutes of hold time, built-in hold time. So, okay. So the question is the crew all going to sleep at the same time, or will there be someone on console? I think for this, they're going to probably follow, for the most part, the shuttle convention, unless, again, you're thinking of things like Space Lab flights. But they are all going to, I believe, sleep at the same time. So the the flight control teams, and they'll be split up into shifts. I believe there may be, again, the naming conventions and the compositions of the teams may be different. Pardon me. But there will be an orbit 1, orbit 2, I assume orbit 3. Orbit 1 would be the crew wake up. Orbit 2 would be the main, the lead flight control shift, and then orbit 3 would be the overnight hours. And so there will be the flight control team and those consoles and all of the support rooms will be staffed 24/7 during the mission. And in fact, they'll be starting on Wednesday. They will probably start probably at least one shift prior to the ascent shift coming on console, if not more than that. So but that's the plan, as far as I understand, is that they will all be sleeping at the same time. And so that's similar to how they did it on most of the shuttle flights, but then also I think for the most part the International Space Station crews also do that now, and they follow a little bit of a different convention now, where they're following because the work is year round. They think they follow the clock. I believe based on UTC. So. Is there any aspect of the mission I'm particularly interested in? I think they talked about the mission being in phases. So yeah, I mean, I think, just based on my background, I'm more interested. More interest, not the right word, but I think the first focus is really going to be actually, again, the pre-launch. It's the launch operations. So tanking on Wednesday, see how that goes. See what we can see for the first crewed launch. Ascent, and then that first approximately 5 hours of the mission are jam-packed. Then it will be interesting to see what the Earth looks like from approximately 75,000 kilometers away, and then they will come back around and do the translunar injection burn. But then obviously lunar flyby on flight day 6. And then the end of the mission will be. It may actually, I have to go back and look, but it may actually be in darkness, but just to see how things go, and then I think really what's ended up happening is because there are other things going on. There's a lot of activity going on, Artemis wise in total, and so I'll go ahead and. Now that we've reached the original start time, I'll go back to the. Let's see if we still have this. So it looks like they've adjusted the camera a little bit. You can see the camera shaking. I'm not sure if you can see. Again, this is a little bit more low res than when I'm at home, but it's windy. I think it varies between just windy and very windy, probably gusty. But that's the vehicle out on the launch pad. All of the major structures are in launch position now. So they earlier in the week they moved the side flame deflectors and extensible columns, which are sort of ganged together. They're on, obviously the name implies side, so they're on the sides of the flame trench. Those are moved into launch position, and then it's over here by the logo, but the engine and booster service platforms were lowered down to the pad surface and then rolled out away from the flame trench out onto the crawlerway, just for the that's where they will be for launch. I believe that may either be the same position that they were for shuttle or approximately the same position. So let me see if I grabbed the or tried to grab the 45th Space Launch Delta 45th forecast. This is the forecast that they issued. I'm gonna, and then I'll start, so to speak. But this was the forecast that they issued yesterday, Saturday, for, let's see. Well, it would have been a little earlier than this, but you can see why ULA decided not to. They decided to call off the launch attempt for today. There's you can see down here. Let me see if I can. I will. Whoops. The ground winds here. Let's go with something a little bit easier, a little more contrast. But you can see the ground winds are forecast to be 25 knots, gusting to 37 knots. So that was. I don't know if it was that. It didn't seem like that a few hours ago, but it certainly was windy. So of course it's probably a little worse right out at the coast. So you can see the winds are coming out of 060. So what is that? East northeast ish. So coming kind of off the water. So yeah. So it doesn't seem, it certainly seems windy right now. I'm looking out the window, but maybe not that bad right at the moment, but I'll have to go back and look. I hope we get that they will issue a forecast for at some point today, like an L-3 forecast, and maybe we will hear something. I don't know that there's going to be a launch weather officer representative today, but there will be one, I believe, on Tuesday. So I'll go back to the top here. Whoops. So where we are right now, again, I thought I would take a look at kind of where Artemis is at the end of the first quarter of 2026, and it's a reminder of several things. One of them is that the calendar just keeps moving. The U.S. is implicitly racing the calendar because of this, essentially a deadline of the end of 2028 to land the next astronauts on the moon. So we've another quarter gone by, and so we have 3 quarters of 2026 left, and then 4 quarters of 2027 before the first lunar landing mission is supposed to fly in early 2028. So not a lot of time, and in that space of time, they're planning on flying 3 missions, 2 and 3 in the next 18 months, perhaps, maybe less. Probably would have to be less if they're going to fly Artemis 4 in early 2028. But they're talking about 3 launches, 3 missions in 2 years, and 4 launches in less than 3, because that will need to be done by the end of 2028. So this is again looking at the overall Artemis plan. Artemis II, again, no later than April 2026. That was a sort of a congressional commitment date. They are, for the most part, not speaking the word May or June. They do have opportunities. They have the first 6 days of this month. I take that back. We're not quite in April yet. First 6 days of April, and then the very last day is in the next launch period 20. But then they also have opportunities in launch period 20 for the next handful of days in early May as well. So, but then Artemis 3 is now planned for mid-2027. A lot of questions about exactly what is going to happen there. Artemis 4 is Well, Artemis 3 is a low Earth orbit flight test. There'll be a rendezvous and docking test. Artemis 4 would be the first lunar landing attempt, and then Artemis 5 would be the second. And obviously, they are hoping that both of those are able to successfully land on the moon. But then, bigger picture than that, everything after that, and even to some extent Artemis 5, but certainly Artemis 6, is still to be determined, to be announced, as to what's going to be in those missions, what launch vehicles are going to fly Artemis 6, what spacecraft are going to fly Artemis 6, and so on. And then we did get that update during the past week that was broader than Artemis. NASA called it Ignition, but again, Ignition encompassed the more than just Artemis, which is where I'm going to stay focused. One of the things that they did not talk about very much was the status of the lunar landers, and so that unfortunately remains one of the, again, sort of a long-term mystery that hopefully we're going to get a little bit more information about hopefully in the next quarter, because this quarter we didn't really get that much about where they are, what their current status is, what's happening right now with the lunar landers in development, and what their schedules are for the rest of the year. But during the quarter, Artemis was reset, and so these were the things that were part of the plan from last year. We are anticipating that. So the plan from last year was announced in the fiscal year 2026 President's budget request. We're now expecting the fiscal year 2027 budget request at the end of this week, and that will obviously be interesting, depending on where we are with this second SLS launch and what its future, what the future that they're planning for SLS to be. Is Artemis 5 the last possible SLS launch? It isn't. There's no guarantee that these missions are going to fly on that schedule that I was talking about. Four in the next less than 3 years. But what they did is they implemented the first phase of cancellations from the fiscal year 2026 budget request. That request canceled all of the SLS upgrades. It canceled Mobile Launcher 2. What's different now is last year they canceled the Gateway, but then Congress appropriated over $2.5 billion to the Gateway program in the Big Beautiful Bill that was enacted in July of last year. So what's happened to Gateway is Gateway will transition from this conceptual orbital outpost around the moon to a bank account. And so all of its assets are being liquidated, and as we saw during this past week, the power and propulsion element, which is probably the farthest along, it had got into final integrated testing where they were getting ready to do environmental testing in a thermal vacuum chamber. That will now be a part of a nuclear electric propulsion demonstration, and they want to fly that in the 2028 Mars transfer window. So that would actually be at the very end of 2028, or at least that's the plan. And if they miss that window, then they'll have to wait another 26 months approximately. But they will probably seize that and start the modifications to the PPE as soon as they can. And of course, again, that works towards the concept of liquidating these assets. We should start to see, for instance, Mobile Launcher 2. We'll probably start to see Mobile Launcher 2. They will start to harvest the umbilical tower and the parts from the Mobile Launcher, and it will actually end up being the opposite of what we were thinking before. So they will harvest parts from Mobile Launcher 2 as spares for Mobile Launcher 1. We were thinking the opposite before when Block 1, SLS Block 1B and EUS and SLS Block 2 with the upgraded solid rocket boosters was going to fly, they were going to retire Mobile Launcher 1 and fly the upgrades on Mobile Launcher 2, and so they were going to use Mobile Launcher 1 as harvest that for spares. And now it's the opposite, because again, SLS is likely to be a short timer in this plan, and then we're just going to have to see how far Congress is willing to sustain. And again, we're using sustainability in a different in a different way here, but we're going to have to see how long Congress is willing to pay for SLS. And so if SLS ends before the end of the decade, then there may be a gap in capability. We're going to have to see whether they are willing to pay, because it's expensive, and that's why they want to cancel it, to use it as a bridge capability between where we are now and where they want to get to with this commercial crew lunar transportation. They're requesting information from industry right now, but they obviously intend to eventually put out a request for proposals and get money from Congress, and that will probably be in the fiscal year 2027 budget request, either for FY 2027 or in the out years. They will propose budgets and line items for FY 28, 29, and probably even 30, even though they will be technically out of office at that point. So that is one of those questions. There are many questions. Is obviously what happens to exploration ground systems, Orion and SLS, after Artemis V. Lockheed Martin has talked about taking Orion private, so to speak, and making it a commercial option that would presumably compete for that commercial lunar transportation system contract or contracts. NASA wants to have two providers, just like they do for commercial crew for the International Space Station crew rotations, but the problem is there's money. So they also wanted to have dual providers for the human lunar landing system, but they didn't have the money to do that at the outset. So again, we will have to see how Washington funds these things, because that will determine how flexible this national capability is, and also how we will see how committed the Washington is to funding this capability versus having industry, and especially SpaceX and Blue Origin, because they have this outside money available to them, how much industry will pay for this, and whether maybe this will be more of a commercial capability, again, assuming there's a business case for it, or there will be a business case for it, versus a national capability that the taxpayers will end up either paying more for or all for. I think the idea is for the taxpayers to cover less of the costs going forward. But again, there needs to be a business case, and we can see, again, they're talking about commercial Earth orbit space stations, crew capable space stations. We're seeing how there are issues with that business case closing. You could see the same thing with lunar with a lunar base, and perhaps needing the government to sustain that for either many years or indefinitely or something else. And so then the other big theme here is we still don't know. We have not gotten we haven't gotten a lot of details about the different missions. They're in development, but there are details that I think we could hear about for Artemis III, and I'll bring up the slides and go through that in a minute. But right now, Artemis II, I think there is the idea that Artemis II is going to, at least for the next couple of weeks thereabouts, be front and center. I think it's one of the things that they talked about during the week is that they've already made the call to send the Artemis III boosters to Kennedy Space Center from Utah. So Northrop Grumman, the Artemis III boosters were finished almost 4 years ago, I believe, 2022. So they've been in storage for a long time. They took the center segments out to paint the red NASA worm logo on them, but they've been ready to go for a long time. So if there is a possibility that those are sent before Artemis II, before the Artemis II mission is completed. So we will have to see if they hold up on that until Artemis II actually launches, or whether they will just go ahead and do that. But the point being, there's a lot of work going on in parallel with launch and mission operations for Artemis II, and it's hard not to want to ask questions about all of those things, because all of that work has been going on before they did this reset of the plan. So again, things that I've talked about forever and ever for the entire life of this channel for more than 2 years. SLS and Orion production, and then HLS development, and again, the schedules for all of those. So again, sort of this, big picture looking at where we are at the end of the first quarter. Artemis II is just about to fly. We're at L-3 days, hopefully. But it also, in a way, as I've said before, everything after Artemis II for over a decade has been in flux. And as we see again, it is now in flux again. So I mistyped that. So Artemis III the LEO flight test would be Artemis III, but we can see now we're going to go from 3 years between missions to just a little bit over a year. So the Artemis III requires a fast turnaround. That's why they're calling the boosters now, because in theory, if they're going to launch in the middle of 2027, you're going to want to start stacking the boosters in the middle of this year. So looking at Mobile Launcher 1, refurbishing it, the boosters would get here in April. Takes them a couple of months to get the aft segments ready for stacking, but in theory, if they launch here in April Artemis II, the mobile launcher and the boosters for Artemis III would be ready to stack by the middle of this year, and that will then set up the timeline to have SLS and then the Orion for Artemis III ready to fly by the middle of 2027. And so that's a fast turnaround, because they weren't contemplating doing that after Artemis I. There was a lot of work that was planned after Artemis I. In this case, the mobile launcher, they're hoping that it's just a refurbishment, and then again the boosters, they need to finish the core stage, but all of the other hardware for Artemis III for SLS is ready to stack. And then right now we're waiting for the SLS core stage and the Orion spacecraft for that build. Then everything gets even faster. So right now Artemis IV, for a number of reasons, has a lot of question marks about the schedule, because they're talking about going to a really fast turnaround between Artemis III and Artemis IV. From mid-2027 to early 2028 is, anywhere from 6 months to 9 months, maybe more, maybe less. And so they're talking about all sorts of things there. So again, I'll go through the slides here in a sec, but in terms of the Artemis III flight test, it's a low Earth orbit rendezvous and docking flight test. Some of the things to be determined: is SLS going to fly with an upper stage, or is it going to fly with a spacer, quote unquote spacer? That's a question, what exactly that means. Are the lunar surface spacesuits that Axiom Space is developing going to be ready? And then these other things. So we don't really know where HLS readiness will be for this flight test. Does the prop transfer demonstration that Starship is going to be doing, does that need to happen before Artemis III, or can they stage the launches such that they don't have to worry about things like boil off for Artemis III? And then again, for Blue Moon, we still don't know what the concept of operations is. We know a lot of rumors about it, but we don't know. There's not a lot of definition to what their concept of operations is, and what type of vehicle or spacecraft they would be offering for Artemis III, for that matter. And again, I'm sort of again, in terms of readiness for the Axiom spacesuits, we're waiting to hear about the status of a crewed test in the thermal vacuum chamber, and then that would be followed in theory by the critical design review. So continuing with Artemis III, again, in terms of what they need to be ready, I was just talking about their NASA says they're going to call the boosters for Artemis III in April. So we would expect to see that train arrive at Kennedy Space Center probably by the end of April. And then again, assuming the launch, we're going to be very interested to see about the condition of Mobile Launcher 1 after the launch. And so they're going to again, there was a lot of talk about the elevator doors being blown off, and they're going to obviously want to harden the systems there, but probably the worst damage to the mobile launcher was due to the pneumatic systems having a break in them. They had a pneumatic leak, which meant they could not wash down the pad, and they could not approach the pad and do those wash downs. And so the solid rocket booster exhaust on the mobile launcher ended up corroding a lot of additional pneumatic lines and other system components. And so that took much longer, I believe, to repair than the elevators, for instance. So there, at this point, you want the mobile launcher refurbishment to be on the order of a number of weeks versus a number of months if you're going to get into stacking for the Artemis III vehicle by the middle of this year or thereabouts. So like maybe not July, maybe September, so summer of 26, I would think you would be expecting to see the SLS for Artemis III being stacked if they're really intending to launch Artemis III by the middle of 2027. And the problem is that if that slides farther into late 2027, that jeopardizes the ability to fly Artemis IV at the beginning of 2028, and then Artemis V as well. So for the Artemis III Orion, some of the next milestones that we should be hearing, or probably hearing, hopefully seeing, the crew module should be, and heat shield should be stacked / mated. That's an upcoming milestone. And then those elements, the crew module and the service module, will be going through thermal cycling test. Well, actually, the thermal cycling test may be for the heat shield, but they will each go through a thermal test and then a direct field acoustic test. And then the next step, the next major milestone, and obviously I would be interested in some of the more minor milestones in between, but just one of the next major milestones after they finish those classes of tests, the thermal test and the direct field acoustic test, is to mate the crew module and the service module. So that's the next big milestone, and then they would go into the altitude chamber in the ONC building, and then eventually they would be handed over to Exploration Ground Systems, and then they would basically be into that pre-stacking preparations. For SLS, waiting to see when the final assembly of the core stage begins. That will also happen in the vehicle assembly building at the Kennedy Space Center. The top 4/5 of the stage are still in New Orleans. They're all mated, and I think we've gotten more status about that than we have about the engine section, and that's probably, again, just the question being, if the top 4/5 is shipped to Kennedy in the April timeframe, is how long are they going to have to wait or to mate that with the engine section, if at all. So So I'm going to go ahead in the name of time. A lot of these watch items have not changed very much. Still waiting to see. Obviously, still waiting to see Artemis II fly, but hopefully that will be in this coming week. Still waiting for Starship version 3 to fly, and when we will see the on-orbit flight testing occur after that. Waiting for the Blue Moon Mark 1 Pathfinder to fly this year, and then again the production milestones for SLS and Orion. And then same thing as I've gone over for Axiom Space with their AXEMU unit. And so again, these are the questions for Artemis 3. When are those production milestones for SLS and Orion? What's the status of HLS? What's the schedule for HLS? What hardware is going to be available for Artemis 3 and when? So, and then there are these other questions about what's going to fly on Artemis 3. Again, what is SLS going to fly with an upper stage or something else? So then with Artemis 4 is supposed to be the lunar landing, but we don't know which lander. We don't know which SLS upper stage. Is it going to be, are they going to save the last ICPS to use that? In theory, that might be available sooner than Centaur 5. That depends, again, on the thing below it, the SLS Centaur EGS integration, making sure that those are compatible and that they work together. And then again, this big one of the biggest question marks is, this will be the shortest turnaround. It wouldn't be between Artemis 4 and 5. That's beginning and late 2028. You could call that somewhere around a year. But middle of 2027 to early 2028 could be as short as 6 months. And so depending on what choices are made, there could be a lot of work to do for a 6-month turnaround between Artemis 3 and Artemis 4. And so this is sort of a little bit of the same. For Artemis 5, we still have the same questions, and we may have, if Centaur 5 is pushed to Artemis 5, then a lot of those questions will still be there in terms of schedule and what milestones, what certification milestones they need to do. And then another question, I think a bigger question than the Orion capabilities are the fifth SLS core stage, because we just haven't seen very much of that hardware. So I think I'll stop there and then switch over to these were the slides that Dr. Lori Glaze presented in the Ignition presentations on, was it Tuesday? It was earlier this past week. And so most of these pictures are relatively old. So this one over here in the upper, this picture of the ICPS is 2.5 years old, going on 3. And a lot of these pictures were taken either last year or earlier than that. But they talked about, again, if they use the ICPS, the third and final ICPS, it's ready. They're going to ship the boosters in April. They don't talk about the status of the engine section, so that's a question mark. The engines obviously have also been in storage; those are ready to go. The TFF core stage top 4/5. That's the forward skirt, liquid oxygen tank, inner tank, and liquid hydrogen tank, and those have all been mated with a transportation simulator for the engine section, which is attached to the aft end of the liquid hydrogen tank. It's basically the core stage engine section structural test article, but it has all of the attachments needed for the transportation system, for the cradle that it will ship on the Pegasus barge in. And then again, the launch vehicle stage adapter is ready. There's also the connector between Orion and ICPS, which is called the Orion stage adapter. That may not completely be ready, but it's one of the simplest components of the rocket, and so it should be. They won't stack that until Orion is ready, and that's going to be obviously next year. So they would just need to be finishing that up. One of the questions, depending on what flies on Artemis 3 and Artemis 4, is if you fly an ICPS spacer. Let's see, I think they have that in here. So then these are the picture of the heat shield in the middle and the picture of the crew module on the right. Obviously, the crew module is almost completely obscured by ground support equipment and ground support personnel. But that's at least a little bit of visual status of the Artemis 3 Orion build. And then, as I said before, most of these pictures are old. So 2023. There's they're doing tests with the Blue Origin active rendezvous proximity operations, the docking hardware for the Blue Moon systems. They already did that for the SpaceX systems, but all of this is already known basically, and so we really don't have much of anything beyond this. So, but then this is the notional plan for Artemis 3. Again, this question of, are they going to use a spacer, or are they going to use the final ICPS? And so one of the questions though is they not only do they only have one more ICPS flight unit, they also only have one more set of connectors for that ICPS unit. So if you fly a spacer and then intend to fly ICPS on Artemis 4, then you're going to need another set of connectors that will fly with ICPS. And so what do you do for this, either for the spacer or the ICPS? I guess you could take the connectors that exist and save those like you would be hypothetically saving ICPS, but then what do you do for the spacer? So obviously one of those hardware questions. One of the interesting things here is they do mention crew ingress events, and so that implies crew capability within the landers. So these wouldn't just be autonomous spacecraft, uncrewed spacecraft that Orion does its rendezvous proximity operations and docking demonstrations with. That would satisfy those test objectives where they're the HLS or HLSs, multiple, plural, serve as a docking target for Orion. But then if the crew is going to get inside, then you could do the full Apollo 9, meaning a couple of the crew get in one or both of the lunar landers, they undock from Orion and separate and go off and fly a far field rendezvous and docking back to Orion, like they did on Apollo 9 with the lunar module and the crew service module, or command service module for Apollo 9. So then looking at the slides for Artemis 4, again, most of these pictures, I believe all of these pictures we've already seen. So again, in some cases, these go back as far as 2023, 2024, 2025. This slide, again, what was interesting about the presentation in this, again, and going down this rabbit hole, but it's important, is that they're talking about there's at least still the possibility that they're still looking at what's feasible or what's realistic for Artemis 4 and Artemis 5. So, but there are many more questions than that. But in the name of at least getting back to Artemis 2 here and questions, I'm gonna go ahead and skip ahead. And at some point, this is this is going to be this is going to be these topics aren't going away. This is the beginning of these discussions and questions. And for the rest of this year and going into next year, these are all going to be standing questions until we hear more about the plans and the schedules. And so they talked about the Axiom suit a little bit, but we didn't hear about the thermal vacuum tests. I don't know that they mentioned a schedule or date for the critical design review for that. And then again, similarly, again, basically just the glossies for the landers, but no status, no schedules. And then this is the same thing for Artemis 4. And then when you get to Artemis 5, now we're looking at really old pictures, in some cases going all the way back to 2022. Actually, the pictures of the RL-10 engines might even be older than that. But that was pretty much the status for that. Let me see if... So there's basically where we are is there are a lot of questions about the future. We have a little bit more details about what's happening, for instance, in April. So they talked about some of the SLS hardware in particular shipping to Kennedy Space Center for Artemis III, the boosters, the engines, and perhaps the let me go back and look. Did this say? Okay, yes, and the top 4/5 from New Orleans. So the top 4/5 of the core stage, in theory, shipped from New Orleans. The RS-25 engines shipped from the Stennis Space Center, where L3 Harris has their final assembly and test shop. And the boosters shipped from Northrop Grumman's Promontory facility in northern Utah. It's actually rather far away. It's a decent drive north of Salt Lake City. So I keep switching to the wrong window. So quick look. So it's still windy. They've adjusted it. There's a decent amount of clouds here today. But that's the Artemis II vehicle. We are more or less, so this time on Wednesday, we will probably have gotten past it's hard to say it's a moment of truth. It's just, I think there's going to be a lot of attention on the fueling of the vehicle on Wednesday morning, assuming that they're still go for launch on Wednesday. This is the countdown at an outline that I went over. So the call to stations is tomorrow afternoon. The countdown clock would start 10 minutes after call to stations. This is the T- time and the L- time. So the countdown clock has 4 hours and 25 minutes of built-in hold time. So it will start at 4:44 p.m. Eastern tomorrow afternoon. Countdown clock would be at T- 45 hours and 15 minutes. The built-in holds are all on launch day. And so this is, again, generically T- 8 hours and 10 minutes. That's when they'll decide whether they're go for tanking. Then when they get to T- 3 hours and 30 minutes, that's the second hold. That would be approximately when the SLS cryogenic liquid propellant stages will be full and in stable replenish, and that would be when they would decide, are they ready for the crew to go to the pad and get on board Orion? And then the final hold is at T- 10 minutes, and that's when they decide, are they go for launch? So, and again, this is just looking at it from the T- and L- times. And so then again, if I did the math correctly, this is when those holds would start. So T- 8 hours, 10 minutes and holding a little bit before 6 in the morning Eastern time. I may or may not start my live stream at that point, but somewhere around there. And so then you can see that isn't where they will start tanking, but that's when they'll be looking at the weather, looking at tanking preparations. Are they ready to tank the vehicle? Then after noon, reasonably well after noon, is when, in theory, the crew would decide whether they're go no go for the crew to go get on board Orion, and then the last hold is 40 minutes before the opening of the 2-hour-long launch window. And then looking at this in a little bit more detail, looking at the milestones, and I keep clicking on the wrong screen. So some of the preparations that they'll be looking at when they're doing the tanking meeting: have they cleared the launch pad? They'll need to switch the purge from dry air to a heated gaseous nitrogen purge. Again, inert gas, trying to minimize fire risks. They'll activate the ground launch sequencer a little bit before they go into the hold. And so then the meeting begins again somewhere around 6 a.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. Again, these times are based on a 6:24 p.m. Eastern time opening of the launch window on April 1st. The opening of the window changes from day to day, so these would be sort of adjusted for April 2nd, for instance, or April 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc. So the deadline for, so to speak, for a go-no-go for tanking would be around 7:35. And then I believe NASA has talked about beginning their live coverage around 7:45 a.m. Eastern. That would be approximately when they would begin the chill downs. And I guess what we'll see is if optimistically, if the weather's good and they're ready to go before that, maybe they start early. That, I guess, is a question. So, but this would be approximately when, if they were to stick to this timeline, which they might, they may not want to get started too early as well. But this is when they would begin chilling down the cross-country transfer lines from the spheres at the pad. You can see, if I switch to the live view, you can see one of those. This is the second of two liquid hydrogen storage spheres. The larger of the two, it was activated finally for Artemis II, and so they'll use both of those to maintain enough propellant to do as many as 4 launch attempts in the 6 days that they have. So after the cross-country lines from those spheres, which are out on the edges of the pad infield, they will then begin chilling down the actual vehicle lines. They're going to start with the core stage. So we should see somewhere around 8:30, we should start to see liquid hydrogen flowing slow fill start, and they will go at a lower flow rate until they cover the 5% sensor at the bottom of the liquid hydrogen tank in the core stage. And so this is really going to be the milestone that we're going to be looking at, because this is where the issues were seen during the first wet dress rehearsal back on February 2nd. They did not see any issues on the second wet dress rehearsal, but that'll be approximately where we'll be looking for this. And it is possible, again, we saw this, I believe we saw this on both of the attempts before they ran into issues on the first one, is that they were a little bit ahead of the timelines. If things are going well, they might start slow fill for liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen sooner. But this will be the approximate time frame, would be in that sort of 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock hour Eastern time on Wednesday. If I'm in Houston, that means it's going to be the 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock hour Central time on Wednesday. But that'll be when we'll be looking or listening, because you can't really see anything, especially for the liquid hydrogen tanking. We'll be listening for the launch commentator to give us a heads up on how that's going. Hopefully we will get more timely updates during tanking. And then this just goes through the rest of the timeline. It does seem like there's a little bit more of a they readjusted the liquid oxygen timelines, I guess, because the idea being that they would get through more of the core stage loading before they start chilling down the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, aka ICPS, the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen lines and tanks. But that's really what will be happening here is they will be, as the core stage tanks get close to or get too full, they will either start or continue the loading of the ICPS. And so these are all of these milestones that we'll be looking for on the day of tanking, because those will be important, because they need to get all 4 tanks across the 2 stages into stable replenish here before they're going to be willing to send the closeout crew to the white room, to the pad. They will get there a little bit before the flight crew, but the idea being there was a little bit of a difference here, and maybe the idea is, after going through all of these rehearsals with the Orion crew module and Orion closeout in the white room, that they want to give the closeout crew a little bit more time in the white room before the flight crew gets there. So according to the timeline that we got, the closeout crew would go out to the pad much sooner than, again, relatively speaking, then the crew will leave the ONC. So rather than necessarily release them at the same time to go, the closeout crew would go to the pad once they get the stable replenish, and they give the go to do that. And then the flight crew would leave the ONC building maybe half hour approximately, and they may, all of these times I think are a little fluid. So that's why we'll have to watch. But this just gives you an idea about, early afternoon on Wednesdays when we would be looking for the flight crew to be, and we will see that. We should also see the closeout crew get to the pad, like we did on back on February 19th for the second wet dress rehearsal. We did get to see more of that activity. That will give us some visual confirmation that they're there. But we should also hear that all 4 tanks are in stable replenish, and that decision that they're ready to send the closeout crew to the pad. And then that, at least once those are in stable replenish, that also means that the flight crew can go to the pad. It's just they may still be staggering when they leave the ONC building a little bit, depending on when the closeout crew gets there. And maybe there is a milestone, so to speak, when the closeout crew gets to a point in their work in the white room where they're like, okay, we're ready for the crew to come out. And so that'll be going on. And then once the crew gets there, they're not budgeting a lot of time, because the connections there are not the time consuming thing. So the crew will get in their seats. They will hook up to the suit umbilicals. There are communications lines that they need. Each one of the crew have their own comm lines. They will do communications checks. We should start to hear, beginning with the commander, Reed Weissman, that may be the first that we hear of the communications checks between him and perhaps the Orion test conductor in the launch control room and the Capcom in Houston. And they will go through, if you remember back to shuttle, they did, again, I'm not sure if they have, in shuttle they had S-band, they had UHF, but we should hear whichever of the different bands they have. They'll go through those comm checks with the different locations. The other umbilical is the suit, is a cooling loop, oxygen loop. Those will be hooked up. They'll leak check those connections, and then they will get into closing out Orion, closing the Orion hatch. There's a lot of work there, as we saw on in the second wet dress rehearsal. And then once they're done with that, they will leak check the crew cabin, and then once that's complete, then they will close the launch abort system hatch, and then eventually they will be they're budgeting extra time for this, and so they'll be pretty close to the time on the timeline that they released last week. The closeout crew would be leaving the pad pretty close to the time that the countdown clock gets down to the T-minus 10-minute mark and holds. So we'll just, we will see. Again, they've done, I believe they've done at least one other rehearsal since the one that they did back on February 19th. And of course they did one in the first wet dress rehearsal, and they've done multiple, they've gone through this many times. Now they've done it many times with the flight hardware, not just in the VAB back in December, but then they did the 2 rehearsals at the pad. Then they did another rehearsal. They ran through that particular part of the timeline while the vehicle was back in the vehicle assembly building in late February, early this month. So and then this is basically the end of the countdown. So once they get into the hold, we will not hear the NASA test director, that entity briefing. I don't think we're going to get to hear that. When it says on here the launch team to the Orion, and I'm just calling that big loop because they're talking about having the launch team, the flight control team, all on the same loop basically. They're all listening to several other loops, but that's probably about the time, which would be 25 minutes maybe, somewhere in there is when we would hear the perhaps. I take that back. It might be a little bit later than that. They have not promised that we will hear that loop until I think around L minus 15 minutes, but we'll see, somewhere around there. They will then the NASA test director will then conduct their poll of the launch team positions, and then I don't know that we will necessarily. I believe that the mission management team head, which that'd be John Honeycutt, would perhaps poll some of his positions, and then the final poll will be the Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell Thompson conducting her poll of the management team heads. And that'll be chief engineering and safety, safety and mission assurance, chief engineers, mission management team head, flight crew, and then assuming everything it's really the opposite. Once everybody is ready, and that could be at 6:14 p.m. or it could be a little bit, it won't be before then that they pick up the clock, but if they need to take an extra 5 minutes, 10 minutes, they probably, they can do that. So that's kind of the timeline for, if that's the timeline for the launch day. So, and then I guess we can go through. I went through some of this, and again, I think unfortunately, I do wish that I got to talk to the folks on the integration console for Artemis I a couple of times, once before and once after but I think what I've learned in the last week or so is that I still need to talk to them again about how the ground launch sequencer works for Artemis versus how it did for shuttle. But these are some of the events and milestones during the final 10 minutes of the count. So we should hear these called out by the ground launch sequencer prime console operator. Let me make sure that I did it again. Let me make sure that I'm looking at that I have this on screen. So at T-minus 8 minutes, I'm not sure that that's not necessarily a milestone, but it's an obvious event. But at T-minus 8 minutes, the crew access arm will be retracted. We saw that during both wet dress rehearsals, although we saw it in the second wet dress rehearsal for both of the terminal countdown runs they did. And then, these are we should hear some of these calls. We didn't hear any of these obviously during the wet dress rehearsal. That was all basically kept secret. But now hopefully we will hear those because it's launch day. I guess they consider this. They're willing to say it on launch day, but they're not willing to say it during wet dress rehearsals. And so this, I believe, most of these are GLS milestones, but then, for instance, we should see hopefully we will see the RS-25 engines. The core stage will gimbal them. It goes through a pre-programmed pattern of engine movements, and that's testing the core stage thrust vector control system, which is a hydraulic system. That's not necessarily a GLS milestone, but it should occur at T-minus 2 minutes 30 seconds. Hopefully we will see that if just as a verification that the TVC is working correctly and the hydraulic systems are working correctly. But I guess the flip side of it is if they're not, then we'll hear about that the other way. But then you can see again, and so the major milestone here, it delineates the ability to resume the clock if there's a hold versus recycle or versus a scrub. At T-minus 90 seconds, they can hold the clock, which is what they did during the second wet dress rehearsal during the first terminal countdown run as a demonstration. They won't want to do that here. But if they have an issue, they can hold the clock at this point, and they have perhaps 3 minutes or so of hold capability where they can try to resolve the issue and pick up the clock again. Then the clock will go the last place where they can hold and recycle is T-minus 33 seconds. So if they could do that, but if they held at 33 seconds, then we're talking about at least on the order of an hour-long delay. And obviously, if they don't have an hour of launch window left at that point, then that would be an automatic scrub for the day because they won't have enough launch window left. But if they hold at 33 seconds, then they can't resume. They have to recycle back to T-minus 10 minutes. And so that's why it would be, give or take, about an hour long. It would be about an hour before they could be ready to recycle. Of course, it depends on if something's wrong, what it is, and whether they can resolve it in parallel with recycling the vehicle. But then you get into some of these other things, and again, depending on which live stream you're watching for launch, we might see some of these milestones. So you won't be able to see the SLS autonomous launch sequencer actually start, but that will be in control of the countdown beginning at 30 seconds. And there's the difference between go for ALS and the start of ALS, and that's where the handoff is between the ground launch sequencer and the SLS flight computers. That will be when they will transmit the T0 time to the SLS flight computers, and that allows the SLS flight computers to, do a lookup on what's the launch azimuth that I'm going to be flying for this T0, and it will go into the final 30 seconds of count. and prepare to launch the vehicle. Again, as I said, we saw this on the NSF NASA spaceflight live stream live, but and then reviewing the NASA live streams, we did not. But at T-minus 25 seconds, they will start the solid rocket booster hydraulic systems, and you can usually see, because you can usually see the smoke from those come out of the exhaust ports on the aft skirts. But if you're not looking at them, then you might not necessarily see them. But then one of the things I don't have in here, and maybe it's on another page, is that they will release the pre-liftoff water in phases beginning, I forget if it's T-minus 17 seconds or T-minus 16 seconds. The hydrogen burn-off igniters fire at T-minus 12 seconds. And then at T-minus 10 seconds, what the autonomous launch sequencer on SLS is looking for is just the GLS. It's waiting for the GLS to give it a go to continue, and if it doesn't get that, then it'll stop. But that allows the GLS to continue to monitor all the ground systems, and if there is an issue, the GLS can stop before 10 seconds. But it's just the final concurrence from the ground launch sequencer to start the engines. And so there's still the capability all the way down to the SRB ignition sequence to stop the countdown even after the engines start. But if the engines start and then they shut down, then we're talking about a very long delay, several weeks. And so let's see. And then this is just going through, again, these milestones in ALS. So I talked about, again, the ignition overpressure protection / sound suppression water release, somewhere around 16 or 17 seconds. I may have the times messed up for the SRB hydraulic power unit starts. If that's at 20, it may be at 28 seconds, or is it 25? Because they'll start the HPUs, and then again, because it's shuttle heritage hardware, they'll do a speed check on the HPUs to make sure that they're running correctly, and then assuming they pass the speed check, then the booster nozzles will go through a very quick the rock and tilt actuators for each nozzle. They'll do a quick check of those of the TVC, and it has to pass those checks, obviously, for the countdown to continue. But we can't necessarily see those. I guess if we were looking at the right camera angles, we could, but I don't know that we're necessarily going to be able to do that, because again, in that last 30 seconds, there are different audiences for looking at the vehicle. There's there's wide shots, there's engineering shots that I would be interested in looking at. For instance, watching the engine start up. So, when the engines start, I want to make sure that the engines are coming up to main stage correctly, but there's only 6 seconds before liftoff, and people are looking for framing the picture right for liftoff. They're not looking at the engineering stuff. So anyway, so in the last 10 seconds, so at T-minus 10 seconds, again, this is when the solid rocket booster start commands, they're getting ready to start the boosters. So they'll issue the arm command to the booster avionics at 10 seconds. Then they open the pre-valves to let the propellant go into the engines. The engines will transition to their start enable mode, and then the core stage will issue the engine start commands at 120 millisecond intervals. And so they're staggered, and they sort of do opposite corner starting the engines, just to avoid having that pressure build up all at once. And so then, assuming that everything is still good, at T0, SLS will issue the Fire 1 and then Fire 2 command, basically one processing cycle after. Fire 1 issues Fire 1 and then Fire 2 on the next processing cycle. And that basically, that sends that goes to the booster avionics. The ignition controller fires the igniter at the top of each booster, and then that signal is then relayed down the booster systems tunnel to the mobile launcher aft skirt electrical umbilical to the launch release system, because that signal is the cue for the mobile launcher to disconnect all of the T0 umbilical plates and then swing all of the arms. And once you send that fire to command and you're committed to, you fire the SRB igniters, the vehicle is going somewhere. So at that point, you have to get all of the connections disconnected and then swing all of the arms out of the way to get them out of the way. And so all of that, I think I mentioned when I was doing that commentary for the Artemis I launch on NSF NASA spaceflight. This all happened so fast. Yes, we're basically just kind of watching, but afterwards go back and watch the whatever engineering cameras we can. So that's going to be. I mean, hopefully we'll have time on launch day, especially after we see that the vehicle tanking, we see how vehicle tanking is going. There will be time to go through this again on launch day. But it is very busy. Again, it just depends on what you're interested in. Those are the kinds of things that I'm going to be interested in on launch day. And so in that last 10 minutes, really what we want to just hear, just like for Artemis I, all we want to hear are the nominal calls by the ground launch sequencer, console operator, and then we will hear a couple of calls from the NASA test director. I believe if we go back to when the launch abort system is armed, so that at 5 minutes 20 seconds, I believe that the NTD will advise the crew of that. And that's the point at which they could use the launch abort system if something happens. So the launch abort system, that abort mode essentially becomes active even before liftoff. That essentially mode 1 abort or set of mode 1 aborts. So let me just take a quick peek over here. All right. So that was kind of, and so that's part of the reason why I wanted to start a little early, was just because there's a lot of material there, and we will have more time hopefully on Wednesday to go through the mission and questions like that. But obviously, if anybody has any questions, I can go back through different points in here. Let me go ahead and let's go ahead and take a look at the vehicle on the pad again. Relatively static shot. It looks like it's still windy out the window here, but not. It seems like it's a little bit less windy. But as somebody was saying, yeah, it's windy enough that they postponed the Atlas launch. I guess I can do that. If there aren't any questions, I will. Let me bring up the launch forecast this is the forecast that was issued yesterday by the Space Launch Delta 45 Weather Office. So this again was yesterday, Saturday. But again, you can see the discussion's important, because they're talking about in general what's going to happen. So the cold front moved across the area. It did do that. I guess there were some coastal showers yesterday, and I guess I did see that we did get some rain out here in Titusville, which is along I-95. But as it says, winds will quickly strengthen, peak gusts near 40 knots. That would have been yesterday. They'll remain elevated today, and then begin to diminish throughout the day today. And so we're late morning now. But then this is interesting. It's like High pressure builds in from the north, and the cold front stalls out across South Florida. Cumulus clouds could create a small issue for both launch opportunities. That I think was talking about today, and then again the possibility of a launch attempt tomorrow. And so we'll see. I guess I could go take a quick peek. Pardon me, and see if they have issued an L-3 forecast. Yes, they have. All right, well, let's just go ahead and do that then. Well, or try and do that. Okay. I'm not sure you can. Yes, you can. Not that it really matters. So, okay. So again, the headline number is only a 20% chance of violating ground, the sort of the surface conditions on Wednesday during that 2-hour launch window. But then there are also winds at altitude that we'll have to hear about, and there may be some other. Again, I don't know if they talk about recovery conditions. It again may not be but that is interesting. So maybe a slightly higher possibility of issues on Thursday. But I mean, again, I think that's it's hard to tell for sure, but that is those will be the rules that they'll be looking at. So I guess it'll still be a little windy. And so, again, so cumulus cloud rule, thick cloud layer rule. I guess the problem there will be visibility of the launch. May not see very much, but I do think, again, and I'm not sure that they will be willing to tell us that pre-launch, but the idea is if you can see the vehicle from the onboard cameras, that they will be willing to show us that live. There's no guarantees though. Again, it may be that those are export controlled, or they're not willing to show those to us. I was never able to get an answer about whether they didn't release the videos for Artemis I because they were secret or because they were dark. And so I guess we would, if they lift off in daylight, we might at least get some idea, because I'm not sure. Again, you get into this, you get into the Fight Club issue if we're talking about secrecy. If they can't talk about the secrecy either. So let's see. So Trevor asks, will the backup crew be on Capcom? That's a good question. I don't think we have heard yet. I will, if I remember, I will try and ask somebody in public affairs to if they will give us the names of the people who are going to be, I guess, especially Capcom for the different flight control teams. We know Stan Love is the Capcom for the Ascent shift, but I don't know if we know for the others. I can't remember if I had time. There's so many questions to ask for in Houston for the flight directors. I don't know that I necessarily asked about the who their Capcom or Capcoms were on their different shifts. But I think we may see Andre and Jenny on at some point. Andre is the primary astronaut support person for the closeout crew, so we should see Andre. Actually, we'll probably see both of them. If memory serves, we saw Jenny Gibbons, the Canadian Space Agency backup. She's backing up Jeremy Hansen. We saw her, I think, during the countdown demonstration test back in December when they did the part 1 part, which was the dry dress rehearsal. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see her in crew quarters on Wednesday when they're getting suited up, but we should see Andre as we saw him during the wet dress rehearsal in the White Room, perhaps on maybe on the way they may give us a little bit a little more of a view, but maybe not. We'll see if they let us see the van show up, or whether the thing is that while the closeout crew is deploying to the pad, the flight crew will be getting suited, doing the suit checks that they're going to do in the crew quarters. They'll leak check the suits there too. So, and that's another good question. I'm not sure we know who's going to be. I think we will hear, and perhaps I think we saw and heard the public affairs officers at some point. I don't know that we'll necessarily see for particular shifts, but we did usually see them during the maybe lower activity times. But I don't know which commentator is going to be on which shift. But I would expect that we will hear Rob Navius for sure. And but I'm not sure. So Rob Navius has been, I can't remember if he used to be media, but that's a long time ago, and he joined NASA Public Affairs, I want to say in the 90s, but it may even be, but that's a while ago. And so he, obviously we heard his voice a lot during the shuttle program, but he's still around. He did the entry shift for Artemis I, but I'm not sure who else is going to be. But yeah, I don't believe they've released that information yet. Maybe they released it yesterday or today. I haven't necessarily had a chance. It's the weekend, so there's that. But hopefully we will get something. Hopefully we'll get something. I do think we will hear. The full, I don't know if they're going to call it air to ground or space to ground now, communication between the crew and the Capcom during the mission, with the obvious exceptions they did during shuttle and they've done during space station, which is there are windows where they do private conversations, either family conferences or medical conferences, and those will be privatized as they've been. That convention's not going to change. But in terms of operational space to ground or air to ground, depending on what they call it, I believe that's what we will hear. We will hear that. So, and that's the expectation, I think, on launch day on Wednesday, is we will hear the crew speaking with, and I'm not sure if we're only going to hear them, but we will hear the crew before liftoff. We'll hear the communications that they're doing. I'm just not sure if we're going to only hear the calls to Houston, to the Capcom, or whether we will hear the calls between the representatives on the launch team, those being the Orion test conductor and the NASA test director. I'm not sure if any others, but those are sort of the typical people on the launch team that would be communicating with the crew. And the thing is that both the Orion test conductor and NASA test director are talking to a whole bunch of people, and those conversations would in theory be going on separate communications channels. And so if we're going to hear all of the communications on the crew channels, then we would hear, in theory, we would hear more on that than just, but we would hear the OTC and the NTD on that channel during the countdown. But we just won't hear any of the other launch team communications until the final, perhaps 15 minutes of the count. So, and again, that's sort of the expectation that we had from earlier, that it'd be similar to what we heard on Artemis I in the final 15 minutes of the count, which is just the final poll by Charlie Blackwell Thompson of the poll that she conducts. That's the final poll, and then she will give the NTD the go to continue the count, and then the NTD will, and again, we'll have to see how that goes for the because for Artemis 1 they'd gotten into the window, and so they picked up sort of in a as soon as they can mode. If they're ready to go and they're just working the timelines, then there may not be any additional steps that they need to do, and they'll just pick up the clock when at the right time. So let me see. So Trevor's asking about the deep space network locations. That's a good question. I don't know if I have. There was a. Let me go back to the. Let me go back to the live shot. And so I think what I'll do is whoops. It's possible that they call the honeysuckle is now called Canberra, but it does look like they're the same. It does look like they're the same positions. Madrid, Goldstone, and Canberra. The transition. Oh, the screen the feed ups wrong place. I'm not sure that there's they will have the deep space network up, but they will be doing tests of the deep space network, because when they go up to the high Earth orbit with the apogee up, it's really more like 74,000 kilometers, but they will probably want to be using the deep space network as they get out to those distances beyond the typical geostationary transfer orbits or those different types of orbits. And this will give them the opportunity to do tests of how well those work, and it may be they probably have as they do during launch and during the rest of the mission, they have the ability to hand over or to take whichever source is better. So, and if you watched there were a couple of simulations that were recordings of simulations that they did, ascent simulations from the crew point of view in the simulator, and then also from the flight control team, where you can hear them talking about the different ground positions during launch, because you have one position that's in the sort of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Kennedy Space Center area that can lose the signals in the solid rocket booster plume, and so they'll switch to there's a ground station at the Ponce de Leon inlet that's north of the area. So they'll switch and they'll go from KUS to PDL, and then they'll hand up to TDRS, and then there will be a then when they finish the apogee raise burn, they'll still when they finish the burn they'll still be at a relatively low altitude, and so they'll probably continue with TDRS for a while. And I think in the timeline they talk about where they're looking to do a handover, but that will probably be evaluated in real time. There is a optical communications demonstration for this mission. The antenna faces to the aft of the spacecraft, and so it's not clear whether the let me bring up the mission timeline or let me try and do that. But the window for I'm going to just close that. That's not right either. Because there's only one optical communication site. It might be Goldstone, or it might I'm not sure. I don't think it is. But the only receiving station they have for that right now is I believe in the continental United States. I don't know if that's like White Sands or if it's a different location or if it's Goldstone, but they won't. If it'll depend on when that's facing the spacecraft, and then also whether the spacecraft I think we're close to a full moon, so the spacecraft is going to want to be in a tail to sun attitude most of the mission, but it obviously will change attitudes when they're doing burns, and when they're, for instance, on lunar flyby day, there's a 3-hour window where they will point the spacecraft windows at the moon and keep those pointed at the moon during that primary observation window on flight day 6. So, and in that case, the antenna would be pointed away from Earth as well. So, so they won't necessarily be able to use it then. And then, of course, there will be a loss of signal during the flyby for a relatively short period of time, when the spacecraft essentially goes behind the moon, as seen from here. So they should have the bandwidth to do that. There are a number of issues, though. One of them being that if those windows are typically during crew sleep, what time of the day is our part of the planet facing the spacecraft? If it happens to be during the middle of the day, of the work day, then in theory you could do live transmissions. But it also depends, again, where's the sun in the sky, and if the sun is close to where the Earth is, then you can point the radiators and the aft end of the spacecraft at the sun, and the antenna can articulate enough to point the laser communications at Earth. But if not, then you have that thing. But then again, there's that part of it, where the sun and the Earth and the moon are. Then the other part of it is what on the planet is facing the spacecraft, and at what time of the day. So I think in February they were thinking it was going to be during more during the crew sleep period of time. Now I'm not so sure, but it's not. They were not highlighting that capability, certainly for live communications. What it would be useful for, if not, is to do high-speed, data transfers. So in theory, you could dump a lot of recorded video in a hurry, and then they'd be able to process that. But then what's interesting is that they're not necessarily carrying this system on Artemis 3. Now, Artemis 3 is now a low Earth orbit flight test, so they will be within they will have TDRS capability. So there's that. I'm not sure whether they're going to have this capability on Artemis 4, but I think that's one of the things. This is a flight test of the optical communication system, and this will, we'll get a feel for how much it can be used in real time or not, and just the operational constraints. So that may be we will just have to see what we'll have to see what we can see. Because I think they did not want to overpromise, I guess, for this mission, and so what might end up happening is assuming that they can use it and they can download these large video files off of Orion storage, then they'll be able to turn those around faster than they were on Artemis 1, where they had to wait until the spacecraft got back home and they got the storage cards and storage, got direct access to the storage. So yeah, that's interesting that they're talking about maybe 400,000 people to view the launch. I know somebody was saying that spring break is winding down, but Easter is next week. Easter Sunday is a week from today. So, and I know there are a lot of breaks. Maybe not the colleges, but there are schools that are breaking either this week, if you consider the week to begin on Sunday, or perhaps even next week. So there could be other people out here, and then I know there are a lot of people who are making the trip regardless of they were ready to do this in February and they're ready to do it now. So we'll have to see. But I do think it is interesting that so they're only talking about a 20% probability of violation for at least right now, and we'll just have to see. Again, does that change? Like I said, this is my argument about schedules too, is like people are comfortable with the fact that the weather forecast could change from today to tomorrow to Tuesday and then all the way to launch day. It's not perfect, but I'm curious about schedules. Even what is this? We're approximately 15 months out from Artemis 3, and schedules for all of the other all of the elements that might be participating in Artemis 3. And I think again that puts a finer point on it, that they are either getting the boosters ready, because it takes a while. They have a transporter. I believe they only have a single transporter for the solid rocket motor segments, and so they have to take all 10 of them one at a time from Promontory down to the railhead, which is, I believe, down in Corinne, and that's a decent drive. So it'll take a little while for them to get all of the segments on the rail cars and then staged properly. So even if they probably will be doing that work even before Artemis 2 launches, at least getting them ready. So, but yeah, I don't. And then again, that's the thing. I think when do we expect the Artemis 3 astronauts to be announced? At this point, I don't think we certainly aren't going to hear about that until after Artemis 2 flies, for sure. And given some of the comments by Jared Isaacman, the NASA administrator, if I had to guess, probably closer to a year before the launch, and especially for Artemis 3. Well, no, I take that back. I was going to say it's not a lunar landing mission, but it is a very, at least conceptually, what we've heard would be a very complicated mission. You could be flying all of the elements both lunar landers and the spacesuits, or the lunar surface spacesuits. And so, it just depends on what they're going to do. But I still think we're talking about, again, Mr. Isaacman talked about something like a year. Now, again, I know there's been a lot of discussions about what happened during Apollo, but one of the things, again, Apollo with the different infrastructure and different conventions, and so if you go back and look at the way that the crews were assigned back then, again, this is the old Deke Slayton crew rotations. So, for instance, the Apollo 11 crew was named the Apollo 11 crew, and I'm going to set aside the issues, the health issues with Mike Collins, but all of them were involved in Apollo 8 in one way, shape, or form. So that crew, I believe, was announced I believe it was in late '67. So they then trained as the backup crew for Apollo 8, or in some cases the primary crew for Apollo 8, when that was still the E mission. But the idea again is they trained for a long time for Apollo 11. So much more than a year. But yes, the Apollo 11 crew wasn't announced as the prime crew until January 1969, and then they flew 6 months later. But they'd been training for Apollo 8 and on all of those systems, and the Apollo E mission included the lunar module, so they'd been training on the lunar module for a long time as well. And the Apollo 8 was not converted, or that crew was not moved from the E mission to the C prime mission until a couple of months before launch. So, but again, because they had all of that background training, and that crew had I believe had trained as a backup crew for one of the was it the C mission or something like that, but they trained for the original command service module test flights. So again, anyway, the point is it's apples and oranges to compare Apollo to Artemis. But the idea, I think, now is that the idea of naming a crew 2 years before a launch when you're flying every year obviously isn't going to work. They're going to be naming crews. We could see them naming the crew less than a year. And I think, again, will they have the Artemis III mission? Will they have it defined well enough by, say, July, by again, middle of the year, to name the crew at that point? And again, we're making the assumption that that this mission Artemis II here flies now, more or less, because if it does, then there's all of the things that need to happen in the next 3 months, turning the mobile launcher around to stack the next SLS and then Orion vehicles, and all of the post-flight work that's going to need to be done after this mission. There was some sense of urgency even before the plan changed, just again because of the idea of, even last year we were thinking about, do you want to keep the option open to fly another Artemis mission in the mid-2027 timeframe, even if you don't know what that is? And you could make the argument that's still the case right now, although they have a little bit more of an idea about what they want to do. So, but if you're going to do that, then you have a relatively quick turnaround to get the mobile launcher and to get the next flight hardware set ready to launch in not much more than a year. And that work will need to go on in parallel with post-flight Artemis II work and training with the Artemis III crew whenever they are announced. So. So let me just go back and so we are getting pretty close to the we're getting pretty close to 11:30, and I think I'm going to go ahead and I'll go ahead and start heading out the door here in a sec, so to speak. I guess what I will need to do, I probably won't get around to scheduling the live streams maybe until tonight, but I am planning on starting early on Wednesday. I think tomorrow is going to be difficult. There's a briefing right after the countdown starts at 5 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, and then there may be some other things. There may be some other things going on, but tomorrow is the main interview day. So all of the interviews that we're going to get to do pre-launch will be during the day tomorrow before the press conference. So I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of time to do that, but I will plan on, if there is, it'll probably be towards the end of the day, although again I'm not so sure about that. I think probably what's more likely is that I will try and find time on Tuesday when I relocate to Houston, but I am planning on starting early on Wednesday, and then I'll just have to decide. I'll have to figure that out exactly when, because if the NASA coverage doesn't begin until 7:45 a.m. Eastern or thereabouts, I think they will probably end up timing it for whenever they start the tanking process, and they'll be monitoring that, obviously. But I'll probably start at least an hour before that, and we'll just have to play it by ear. And kind of like today, if it sounds like things are happening sooner, then I may come on earlier than scheduled. But that's basically what we're going to be doing throughout the mission as much as I can, which is to just watch the mission, hang out, answer questions, and follow along as they on Wednesday as they get the vehicle ready to lift off, and then once the mission starts, to just follow it as much as I can all the way through splashdown. And then if NASA has an event down in San Diego, that would obviously be something else that would be interesting to go see if possible. So, but yeah, I'm planning on, again, depending on, assuming that the launch is still scheduled for Wednesday, and maybe anyways, I'll be in Houston on launch day, certainly planning on Wednesday, and then follow the mission from there, or because it's going to be it's going to be, I've said this a couple of times, there are going to be thousands of media people that will be documenting the launch and the countdown and the day here, the day at the place that we're looking at on screen here, the Kennedy Space Center. And so we're going to see all sorts of stills and video of the launch, and not just live, but then after the fact, after the photographers are able to go get their remote cameras. So we should see all of those cool things, both in real time, but then also in afterwards as we get more of that coverage. And so there's a lot of people doing that, and I'm going to focus on the mission operations as much as I can, and we'll just to figure out whether I think Houston's going to be the right place to do that, certainly for the first couple of days, and then certainly for like lunar flyby day, and then I'll have to decide whether it makes sense to stay in Houston for the whole mission, or whether I'm going to go, since I live out on the West Coast. I don't live in San Diego, but I live close enough. I'm not going to necessarily, there's nothing happening in San Diego on splashdown day, but it may make sense to go out to just we'll be covering the mission based on the live streams that we're getting, and then there will be status briefings in Houston almost every flight day. at the end of typically at the end of the orbit 2 or lead flight control team shift. But we'll just have to see. We'll have to see how that goes. Perhaps it's another one here. So, so that's probably a good. This is probably a good place to leave things for now. Thanks to everybody for watching. I think there's going to be a lot of time for. There's going to be a lot more time for questions and a lot more time. And again, there will be Wednesday's going to be a long day. I have to go back and look, but I mean, I think the crew's first sleep shift, so to speak, is going to be divided by the perigee raise burn, which is approximately 12 hours after launch. But the first 5 hours of the mission after the vehicle lifts off there's a lot of things going on in there. For the most part, the last big event being that proximity operations, manual piloting, manual handling qualities demonstration. But I mean, all the things that happen before that, the liftoff, the insertion into the initial orbit, then the burn to go up to the high Earth orbit, and then that proximity operations demo. So we're going to go from over 12 hours approximately. So 12 hours before liftoff to 5 hours after liftoff, and maybe a little bit more. So like I said, that's a long day. There will be plenty of time for questions. Although again, I think after the vehicle, once we get down into the latter part of the countdown, and certainly after the vehicle's on orbit, we'll have to see where there's time for, we'll be watching to see when there's live TV and what coverage there is. So, but as I said, thanks to everybody for stopping by. Thanks to the members of the channel for supporting me. If anybody feels like, if anybody's willing to, like and subscribe if you aren't already, and if you want to make a donation, as I say in the videos all the time, I would really appreciate it. That link is down in the lower right, as usual. But anyway, thanks for tuning into the live stream. I'll post a note about when the next live streams are scheduled, but I'm definitely going to be spending most of Wednesday covering the countdown, and then hopefully the beginning of the mission. And I'm expecting at some point there will be a break in there to do some commentary on the live coverage that NSF NASA Spaceflight is providing. They're doing all of their wall-to-wall coverage too. So, and them and everybody else. So, but anyway, the crew news conference is coming up in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off now. Thanks again to everybody for tuning in, and I will see you. If I don't see you before Wednesday, hopefully I will see you guys on Wednesday.